I just want to welcome you all. I'm Peggy Rich. I'm the president of the Historical Society, and I just want to welcome all of you here this afternoon to see the exhibit and hear a lecture. I think it's going to be very interesting. And I want to remind you about the tablescapes that are going to be at the Life and Patterson House next weekend, Friday from 1 to 5, and Saturday from 10 to 5, and Sunday from 2 to 5. And Sue White and her committee have worked really hard on getting this together. And we think it will be an interesting thing and hope that it will get some more people into the LP house. So don't forget that next weekend. And Ann is going to introduce our program.
Thank you, Peggy. It's certainly my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Koslow. We first had the pleasure of meeting when Dr. Koslow brought some students up from FSU, where she is an assistant professor in the history department and directs the public history program and the historical administration program. So we were very fortunate to have one of her interns with us for the last semester, Tyler McLean, who did a lot of work for us. And we had booked this traveling exhibit on domestic help in the Gilded Age South well over a year and a half ago, while negotiations were still underway on who would take the Life and Patterson House off the hands of the state of Georgia. We actually had to submit a bid through the bidding process to do that. And because we had committed to have the exhibit over here, even though there is definitely a correlation with that period of time, we had it here so we can do the tablescapes. But when I start looking for a speaker for programs, naturally FSU is one of the first places I look to see what the different interests are of the various people in the history department. And I was delighted to find that Dr. Koslow's, among her interests, are women's history and the Gilded and Progressive era. So it was a perfect tie-in. She came to FSU from Chicago, where she had worked with the William Scholl family and History Center, and she has published a book on women's role in public health in Los Angeles. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Koslow.
I'm a little bit short. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me here today. And I very much look forward to talking about the three things that are central to my world. Public history, which is public presentations of history, women's history, and the Gilded Age / Progressive era. So those three things are what I do. My research is in those areas, and I do run our public history program. And my first book was on women's engagement in public policy and public health, and my second book will be on health exhibits that were used every day during this period in the late 19th, early 20th century. So I really do combine all of those three things. Now, this is not a phone I'm going to use as a timer, so just so you know. Okay. So until fairly recently, you have been hard-pressed to find yourself hearing about the history of domestic service anytime you entered a museum or went to a historic house or historic site. And in fact, it's still relatively uncommon. The first glimmers where we have a beginning of the telling of this history are more in the history of enslaved persons versus Gilded Age Progressive era. And that makes this exhibit really unique because of its focus post-emancipation. The few places where you can begin to see the history of domestic service is in talks about kitchens. That's where you will often hear about the help that actually worked and ran the house. But we do know that those who were cooks held a very special place in domestic service. And we tend to hear very little about the domestic service that ran the rest of the house. Now, the reluctance to talk about that history can be traced to numerous factors. One is often the donor who left a house or left the materials in a house wanted the history of the house to really be about the owners. It's often about the decorative arts that were collected in the house. Two, you might have docents who've worked for 35, 50 years, sometimes longer, and they've worked very hard to tell the history of a house. And it's very hard to ask someone to change how they tell that history. Also, you can have reluctance, especially when you have to grapple with issues of race and issues of sexism. Those are very hard histories to grapple with, but they're there in domestic service, and that's another reluctance to grapple with those histories in a historic site. And lastly, there's of course modern politics, right? I mean, the issues that are current today about domestic service and the politics of domestic service, those issues are very present, and sometimes they get wrapped up in the ways that we try and tell the past. So there's a number of reasons that we can understand why the history of domestic service has not been the first thing that we tend to see when we go into a house. But what I want to do today is talk about, one, a little bit about the history of domestic service, and then two, examples of historic sites that are trying to grapple with bringing that history into their narrative, and talking about how difficult that is and how complicated that is, but the promise of doing that. And the two examples, one's in Philadelphia, and the other one is Federal Hill in Kentucky. I know that this exhibit focuses on the South, but particularly with the history of enslaved people, that's not just a Southern story. So the history of domestic service is really a universal one. It doesn't belong to any particular region. So that's what I'm going to do. And basically, even though those examples are going to focus on trying to bring the history of enslaved domestic service into the story, I think the same themes are present when you look through this exhibit about the progressive era. Now, domestic service, it should be of no surprise to anybody that in the history of the United States, women's labor has always sustained household economies. And we know that in the colonial period, these houses are sites of production, right? They're not just, quote, the home. They're places where food is produced, where clothes are produced, where materials for bartering and trading with other families are produced. All of that is within the home. So there's no distinction between a place that's a home and a place of work. They are the same. Now, in the beginning, indentured servants are part of the colonial mix, as are enslaved people. But even in sites where we see women working as helpers, even when they're not indentured servants, even when they're not getting paid for their labor. And a great example is that there's this wonderful diary of a woman named Martha Ballard, who was a very successful midwife in New England. And a historian, Laurel Ulrich, has uncovered the history from that. And she calculated that between 1785 and 1800, that's 15 years, 39 young women came to work in the household, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for a few weeks. And these women in the neighborhood were sent to work in the Ballard household to learn how to spin, or to help with the spinning, to help with the wash. If someone was sick, they would come. So young women came into this household and they were helpers. They did the domestic labor in the house, but they also learned important skills that then they brought back to their own households. Now, North and South, enslaved women performed these duties as well, and so their help sustained this economy at the same time that they're learning skills. Now, as the Industrial Revolution comes to take hold in the 19th century, we do begin to see a distinction between home and work. But I would put those in quotation marks. Clearly, homes still involve lots of labor. This is pre-electricity, and I would even add, even when electricity comes in, if you look at some of those early vacuum cleaners and early equipment, it's really debatable. And even, we do know that post 1950s, that even though you get all this great new equipment, actually the numbers of hours that women are doing household work in order to clean, cook, etc., actually expands rather than decreases when you look at the figures. But essentially with industrialization, you get this new thing called a middle class that we didn't really have quite in the same way. Factories have to have managers. And so managers had these new types of households, and they idealized them, and they talked about, if you were a true woman, here are the things you needed to do. You need to spend time cultivating your skills as a homemaker, paying attention to your husband, your family, and not doing what came to be seen the drudgery of the labor of who's going to clean the kitchen, who's going to clean the laundry, who's going to do all those things. So hiring a domestic servant became a means to say, I am middle class because I have enough wealth in order to hire someone that my wife doesn't have to do all of that. It was the same as sending your daughters to college. That was a sign that you didn't need their labor. So what we see then is domestic service becomes an option for women who will now become working class women to have paid employment. And domestic service becomes a paid option. We see in cities where you have industrialization and factories, you also see out in rural areas, you see mechanization of agriculture. And one of the things that mechanization of agriculture does is it frees up labor, particularly young women's labor. So young women are actually the first to move to the cities to take opportunities in these new places. The Lowell Mills is a great example. That does not work. If their labor is needed on a farm, you can't have the Lowell Mills. So in Chicago, for instance, when you do the statistics, you see that the first major numbers of people migrating from rural areas to the city are young women, and they are coming to work as domestic servants. Now, while plentiful, these are not always the most attractive jobs for young single women. If you ever read Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser, it's a fictional account of this story, but it had a lot of truth in that story. If you were a domestic servant and you lived in, you were at the beck and call of your employer. So you're working long hours. You have multiple duties that you're asked to perform that you may not have originally signed up for. You may be asked to take care of children when you weren't originally asked to do that. And so it's hardly surprising to find that there's conflict in households about domestic service. And we see a discussion in the journals in the late 19th century, early 20th, by middle-class women saying, we've got, quote, a servant problem. And by that, they could never keep, quote, good help, and when they could keep good help always seemed to leave. And they could never figure out why, or at least in the journals, it always indicates they couldn't figure out what's going on. But it's pretty clear that, especially in places where young women had options, they often exercised them. So young women would choose in certain cities to go work in a factory as opposed to being domestic servants. And that's because if you're working as a domestic servant, it can be a fairly isolating experience. You may be the only person there in the house, in a private home. If you're a young woman and you go work in a factory, you get to be around other young women, which even if you're not always talking while you're working, you get breaks, and it's a whole different kind of work culture. So what we see is, especially in northern cities, many young women say they start off as domestic servants, but then quickly move into these other positions in the factory because for those variety of reasons. Now, in the South, you could see things like African American women choosing to be washerwomen, even though washing, right, there's a panel back there that's going to tell you about how long and how hard it was to do. Over, we're talking somewhere between 10 and 20 hours, depending on the amount of laundry, and very, very dangerous. So but African American women might choose to be washerwomen rather than be domestic servants. And so those are great examples of, even though this is an option for many women, if there are other options, women would try and find how to access them. So, and especially the talk about the servant problem, the ability of those things, they're often symbolic. And so one of the things we know is some people will ask me, well, you know, for African American women, you know, really is there a difference between what they were experiencing as enslaved women versus now as free women? And what we often find in the historical record is, even though sometimes the conditions, working conditions weren't that different, the symbolic ability to leave your job, and women did, was very, very important. So emancipation did matter. Now, again, the thing is that this history is written about, there's so many books you can read that tell you the history of working class women of this period. I mean, bookshelves. And that came about in the 1970s, but very little of that history actually appears in museums or on historic sites. One of the most famous stories is Mary Malone, who is often called Typhoid Mary, who is a domestic servant. She was a cook, and in terms of where that status was, she was a very, very good cook, and she worked for a lot of wealthy families. But that history, that's only one of the few times you really hear about someone who's famous, who is a domestic servant. Other times it's much more anonymous, and that's one of the reasons that history is very hard to get at. So these two examples I'm going to give you are from a period before 1890, but I think they're the same types of themes that this exhibit's bringing up. How do you get at this history? How do you weave it into your historic site? So the first one is the federal government grappling with this question. And in the early 1990s, the National Park Service had decided to move the Liberty Bell, and they were revamping Independence Mall and all of the kinds of things that they have to talk about independence within the city of Philadelphia. And has anyone been to the new Independence? See a few people, okay. I have not. But one of the things, did you go to the Liberty Bell? All right, did you know that you were standing on the site of the president's house? See how they were successful or no? No? Uh-oh. Well, this is the thing. They had decided they were going to put the Liberty Bell in a new glass and steel structure, and they were moving it to the site, which was the former mansion of George and Martha Washington from 1790 to 1797, when first presidency, and when Philadelphia was the nation's capital as they began to build down in D.C. After the Washingtons were done, John and Abigail Adams took up residency in this mansion, and they lived there until the White House was ready for them, which was 1800. So the site that was chosen for the Liberty Bell was also the site where the president's house used to be, and that's what the mansion was called. So when they did this, they actually, there's nothing left of the house, right? You didn't see a house when you were there. Yes. The house is gone. When the Adams left for D.C., the house was turned into a hotel, but then it was demolished in 1951 to make way for Independence Mall. And so there was nothing there, the NPS said, to interpret to the public that they were walking on the grounds of the president's house or anyone who had lived there, which I should say, before George and Martha lived there, and the other folks who lived in this house included Richard Penn, the grandson of William Penn, founder of Philadelphia. They also included Sir William Howe, who was the British general who occupied the residence during the Revolution. Benedict Arnold had lived there for a while, as had Robert Morris. So there was no shortage of famous people who had lived in that residence for them to tap into. It was quite significant. But here they go, they've got no house, and they say to historian Gary Nash, who was working on a book about Philadelphia, the memory of the Revolution, that who said to them, look, you've got this site where clearly the Liberty Bell meant many things to many people. And NPS responded to him that it would be too confusing to the public to talk about a house that wasn't there, too complicated to offer multiple interpretations of the meaning of freedom, and lastly, and perhaps most importantly for NPS, too expensive to change their plans. So he was told the train had left the station. Well, that wasn't good enough for Gary Nash, and he didn't give up, and he got members of the local African American community to help him to get NPS to reconsider, and he got the ear of the head of NPS as well. So after much discussion and a directive by the director of NPS, they figured out a way that they were going to turn the waiting room into a space for exhibition, and to talk about the history of the house, and to talk about the history of enslaved people who worked within the house. And in particular, what they, in that space, which you didn't learn about yet, but they're working on, is that in that waiting area is actually the grounds where the president's house would be. So while you're waiting to see the Liberty Bell, you're physically in the space that the president's house was. So there's two stories that they're going to use to tell the story of domestic servants who worked in the house. One is Oni Judge and the other is Hercules, and they both worked for Washington. And does anyone know their stories? I'm going to tell you their stories. They're really interesting stories. Oni Judge was born at Mount Vernon, and she was tasked to attend to Martha Washington when she was 10. And when Martha Washington brought her to D.C., Oni Judge was given a position of honor in the household, or at least what the Washingtons considered a position of privilege. And she helped Martha Washington get ready for parties, state functions. She ran errands for her, which meant she had a certain degree of freedom. And she would accompany Martha Washington when Martha Washington would go visit the wives of other politicians and diplomats. 6 years later, in 1796, Oni flees to New Hampshire on one of those errands. What had happened? Well, the Washingtons, so she's 16 when she does this, the Washingtons were preparing to return to Mount Vernon, and Martha was going to give Oni to her granddaughter as a wedding present. And Oni found that out. So Washington hires agents to track her down and bring her back. They do find her, and she says she'll come back if they emancipate her. And they say no. So she responds, and the quote is, quote, should rather suffer death than return to slavery. And Washington's agent reports that one of the problems in getting her back from New Hampshire is that New Hampshire is, quote, popular opinion here is in universal freedom, and no one's going to help him bring her back. So Washington tries in various ways for the next 2 years, quietly to get her to come back, and she refuses. And after his death, those attempts were given up, and she lives out her life in New Hampshire, poor but free. Now, the second person was that the NPS officials have decided to include in the interpretation was the chef, Hercules. He cooked all the state dinners. He cooked all the family meals for over 10 years, and he too slips away from the house. He doesn't go to New Hampshire, though. He goes to the countryside in New York, and he also outwits Washington's attempts to bring him back. And basically, it's after Hercules leaves that Washington decides he's got to bring everybody back to Mount Vernon. This is not working in Philadelphia. And we know that Philadelphia was the site of largest number of free black community in the north. All those things are working against him. So he writes to his secretary in 1797 that he thought, quote, the idea of freedom might be too great a temptation to resist. He orders all the enslaved servants back to Mount Vernon, and he does this in a way that, quote, I wish to have it accomplished under a pretext that may deceive both them and the public. So I think one of the things is that people are very aware of freedom, not freedom. And it was something that these domestic servants wanted to secure. So what's happening now is in their process of developing an exhibit that's going to talk about this. And theoretically, in the next couple of years, when you go to the Liberty Bell and you sit in that waiting area, you're going to hear about the president's house. You're going to hear about all of those different politicians who live there. And then you're also going to learn about the enslaved people who worked in the house, who lived in the house, and also who fled the house. So the second example is, how am I doing that time? The second example is in Kentucky. You may have heard the song, My Old Kentucky Home. And that home is a song about a mansion that was built in 1818 at Federal Hill, which was the 285-acre estate of Judge and U.S. Senator John Rowan. And if you look at a quarter from Kentucky from 2001, the house that's on it is this house. So Stephen Foster was Rowan's distant cousin, and he's the one who created that song for the state, and it's supposedly about that house. So in 1922, the Rowan family sells the estate to the state of Kentucky, and they request that be a memorial to Stephen Foster. So here you have that example of the donors have a very clear sense what they want the history of the house to be, what the mission statement of the museum should be. So until 2002, tours of the house never mentioned slavery. All work was done by servants. And that is historically accurate, but it does convey something very different in its connotations than to say the word enslaved servant. Now, for those who read a lot of history, who know history, know, oh, servant, they mean someone who is not free. But for many new people to the United States, or for young people, they don't know that history. And so that's where I think some people are very troubled by the use of servant instead of enslaved servant or enslaved person or something like that. So a graduate student named Eric Browning, who is at the University of Kentucky, had been interning at the site, and he said, well, how about I craft for you a tour that brings into this history the experience of enslaved people. Because one of the things we know about any of these large houses is, or any of these plantations, they're sites of work as much as they are sites of living. So he created an alternative script, and what he did was he brought that history of domestic service throughout the entire house. And in this way, it's a really good model for anyone who's trying to figure out how to tell the history of how did the house function as a workspace as much as a living space. So when they were in the parlor, visitors were going to be told, quote, the backbone of this and many antebellum homes in Kentucky were based on the labor of enslaved people. That enslaved people made all the bricks, they hewed all the trees and framing, and they did all the labor. Moving into the dining room, you would be told that slaves prepared all the meals. When you went to a bedroom, that the furniture was dusted and kept clean by the slaves. Those are all things that happen all the time, but they happen miraculously, right? Somehow someone comes and dusts. Someone makes the bed. Someone, right, in this day and age is going and removing yes, right? Then there's the question of fires in the house, right? All these places have fireplaces. So part of the text was to say that slaves were the ones to cut, haul, and season the wood, carried up 2 flights of steps to the bedrooms to keep the fires burning. As part of the text on the 3rd floor, which was the nursery in this house, it was said children were kept on the 3rd floor with a slave woman to care for them and serve as a wet nurse. Then, for example, you'd be in what was carved out to be kind of a bathroom in the house, and there was a bathtub, and the question was, here, where did the water come from? Who got the water there, and where did the water go? So the intern had included a sentence that said, when you were at the hip bath, the slaves pumped water into the well, heated it in the kitchen, carried it up the 2 flights of stairs, and poured it into the bottom, and later drained the water. So there's a way that this intern was trying to make visible all of the labor that happened in the house. And that's a very hard thing to make visible to people. So the park superintendent sent the script to the assistant director of historic sites of the Kentucky Department of Parks. 3 months later, there was a meeting to discuss the suggestions, but the assistant director was unhappy with sprinkling the history of domestic service throughout the house and wanted it isolated to the dining room and/or hall. They also didn't want to make it mandatory because they felt it should be up to the visitors to determine what kind of tour they wanted, whether they wanted to hear more about the decorative arts, whether they wanted to hear more about the family, or whether they wanted to hear more about domestic servants. Lastly, and I think this was the one where probably this person stopped interning there, they were asked if he could include a statement in the script that offered something positive about slavery. And he responded that he could not, and to suggest that there would be something would be to sugarcoat the story of enslavement. And I think there's a tension there that is not often spoken about, but is clearly there. And it's very difficult to deal with, right? So when you're the person who's giving the tour, really there is nothing positive to say about slavery. But there is something positive to say about how people work very hard in that house to make that house function. And I think understanding that domestic labor made these houses function is very important to understanding the history of that time period. So in subsequent emails, Eric did condense the information, and so now the goal was that you go into the dining room and you'd be told about the family, you'd be told about the decorative arts, but you would also be told that, quote, the slaves prepared the meals, like any of the other large estate owners of the early 19th century. The Romans owned slaves. The slaves were the ones who built and maintained the home and land, tended to the needs and the desires of their white owners and children. So, in fact, rather than be a separate script, the goal was to integrate it into the discussion everyone was going to hear. As of 2006, it had not yet been incorporated in, and the hope is that by now it has. So where does this leave us? In 57 seconds. What I want to say is it's a very hard history. We know a lot about women's history. We know a lot about the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. We know a lot about slavery. We know a lot about enslaved people's experiences. And yet, for all of the books we have, for all the articles we have, we still have a very hard time incorporating this into our historic sites and spaces. And my hope is that discussions like this, and as you yourselves go into historic sites and houses, that perhaps you ask a question, what was the bell on the wall that was used for? And it's oftentimes the docents have this great wealth of information about the workers in the house and how they made the house habitable and a space for living, a space for parties. But they're reticent to speak about it. And I think that's one of the things that if you can draw those stories out, it makes docents more comfortable talking about them in the future. Because as we all know, and it's not just the big mansions on the hill, even small houses in the 19th century, we know that they did not function without the work of domestic servants. Now, when you're looking at the exhibit, one of the things to think about is it gives you all sorts of wonderful information about the practicalities of how this happened. And for any of you who have grandchildren or children who bemoan how, doing things, bring back a few citations about, if you lived in 1900, it would have taken you this much longer to make a dinner. than it would today. So I think it's all useful, wonderful information. So, and I wanted to open this up to questions. I want to make sure. Oh, I didn't put my glasses, so I don't need them for reading, but I do need them for seeing. Yes.
One question, is there much research being done on the relationship between the people, between the owners and the slaves, or the masters and the servants? But you know, the book, The Help, is very much
Right.
about how that relationship, it differs from one side to the other, and I wondered if it was anything being looked at that for earlier periods.
Very much. I think what we have found is that, I would call it, those are very complicated, intimate relationships that were negotiated over time. And so, especially in the case of someone like Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson, that issue has come up a great deal. And even the relationship between, right, household help that looks after your children, that research question has come up a lot. And the answer is usually that there's that intimacy is sometimes mistaken for something else. And as much as domestic servants are part of someone's household, they are paid labor. And that one shouldn't mistake familiarity with friendship. And so that clearly, that does come out. The book, I haven't read the book, but my understanding is the book is about misunderstood relationships. And that is borne out by the historical research, is that a lot of the employers say, oh, I don't understand, we were in such good relationships, but the employees decide to seek a better working option when it's in their interests. So that is there.
Over the past 20 years, I've had the opportunity of working on probably 7 or 8 of the different plantations with these people. And I find that the owners, the people that are paying, have treated everyone absolutely fine, very, very well.
Right, well, and I think there's, and that's where present politics and past history sometimes get overlapped or misunderstood. So what we're talking about 1890 and 1910 is not necessarily the same working conditions as existed in 1950. And you can't generalize from any particular story. What a historian will tell you is you have to look at a particular moment and place and space and look at how those conditions function. And you could have some employee-employer relationships that were very, very good, mutually beneficial, where people stayed on, where you have legacies of people staying on. But you can also have employer-employee relationships where that doesn't exist. And so the thing, what the historical research shows is that sometimes employers, especially right after emancipation, into the early 20th century, mistook familiarity with something else. And that employees, when they had the option, would go seek other options. Because domestic service is one of the hardest jobs anyone has to do, especially in 1890 and 1910. It's just hours and hours and hours of backbreaking work. And so young women, if they had the option to go work in a factory, usually took it, or to live out.
What's a wet nurse?
So wet nurse, what would happen is that they would breast...
Never mind.
But actually, it was for domestic servants, it was a great option. It was a great option for many working class women, especially in the early 20th century. And what would happen is doctors would tell women breastfeeding is best. But then doctors in the early 20th century also told middle-class women that you need to spend more time with your husbands and devote more time to the rest of your family. So they gave them these very strict guidelines on when to nurse. And in fact, one of the things we know about nursing is it's based on supply is based on demand. So if the baby's hungry and you don't feed it, your supply will go down. And so what happened for many middle-class women is they were being told, do not nurse, especially in the first 3 months, more than 4 hours per every 4 hours. Well, that scientifically we know that doesn't work. Your milk supply will go down. So many middle-class women found themselves in this predicament. They couldn't actually meet the demand of their children. So it opened up this space for many working-class women to be able to wet nurse. And that also gave them somewhat of a privileged position, right? There's hierarchy of domestic labor. Cooks had a very privileged position. Wet nurses had a more privileged position. The servant who has to wash the pans, who has to wash the floors, is usually the youngest, usually the lowest on the totem pole, and who usually will turn around in that job is more often.
She scolded me over there. I'm not clearing that question.
Well, we don't use it there so much anymore, but it used to be a very, I wouldn't say lucrative, but it was definitely many women would do it because you made a decent wage. You could make a decent wage as a wet nurse.
It's being done today.
Yeah.
It really is. It's being done today.
I guess a lot of the history from especially from the African American perspective, has been based on oral history for that period. I mean, where do you find it unless it's been written by someone who was living?
You find it either in the complaints, right? You could find it you have to take an alternative path. So it definitely very much is in the oral histories of families. And I do know that sometimes, right, one of the things is also, because it wasn't it was a position many women had, but it wasn't given the most, in terms of status, right, low status. And so it's not something people talked about that much. Was sort of undiscussed. And so, what? Right, captures some of it. But many people wouldn't want to talk about it. And so that's one of the things, too, that you confront, is that it's a history that many people don't want to talk about because either it did not place them in a position of, esteem or status. For some people, if they had a bad experience, it was too painful to talk about. If they had because it does make you vulnerable, so we know that domestic servants were vulnerable in all sorts of ways. And so any of those vulnerabilities people wouldn't want to talk about. But you can find it in the records of the house, the employer. I had to fire so-and-so. I had to hire somebody new. They're not working the way I want them to. So those are the ways they kind of get at it in a different direction. But that skews some of the research as well, right? If you're only hearing about the complaints and never about this worked really well, and my household's functioning very well, you tend not to hear about that because people don't write that down. So that's one thing when historians have to be mindful when they're doing the research, is that complaints can't be mistaken for a universal experience either. But you have to go at it those different directions, and oral histories, and getting people to feel comfortable with talking about it, which is hard.
I guess a lot of it comes out on the music of that period as well, folk music.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that most interesting talk. walk. And remember that the exhibit will be here through January 27th, so if you have family in over the holidays, be sure and invite them to come tour the museum, and it's included in regular admission. And we'll have refreshments out in just a minute, so we hope you'll stay and visit and look around. And as Peggy mentioned, don't forget the special event at the Lapham Patterson House next weekend. If you haven't been there in a while, we think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the way the house looks. You can see there's been a lot of work. As of Friday, there was still white paint on the front, but our painter assures me it'll be yellow by next Friday. So we've been steadily working on it now for a year and a half, so we hope you'll turn out. Thank you again.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. 5 minutes early.